Hello all, so this is a video I'm making about the Highland Cemetery tour. It happens every year in October in Ypsilanti, Michigan, led by a local historian. It is a lot of fun. You're actually given a true oil-burning lantern to carry on. I want to make sure though to note that this is not a ghost hunting expedition whatsoever. It's led by a serious historian, and although it is a lot of fun, there's nothing paranormal going on. Throughout this video, you might see odd reflections and other things. That's just the fact that this was done with a very low-grade camera. You know, I didn't have any real equipment for sound or anything like that. And stuff is reflecting off these headstones. That's all that is. Nothing paranormal ever goes on in these tours. And as I said before, the local historian, James Mann, is not a ghost hunter. Alright, it is time for the Highland Cemetery tour. It's going to be a lot of fun. I think this is my third one. Every year I've been doing this, we've had great turnout. Of course, what makes this year in this state interesting is we also have very beautiful weather.
My name is James Mann. I've been doing these tours for about 12-15 years. My sanity has been questioned. But you can't question what's not there. One other announcement, if you get separated from the group and the cemetery zombies carry you off to do whatever they do, that's not my problem. The first time I made that announcement, a little boy attached himself to me for the rest of the evening and told me more about zombies than I ever wanted to know. Now, these tours began when the History Club at Eastern asked if I would give them a tour of Highland Cemetery at night. And they said they would pay me. I said yes. The Board of Trustees gave me permission to give the tour. And I noticed something interesting. When you give a tour at night, it gets dark. I didn't have lanterns that year. Next year I was allowed to give the tour on my own. I got some lanterns. And by the way, the students advertised the tour on campus as a ghost tour. Someone called the office here and complained, "You're dealing with forces you don't understand." When the Board of Trustees was told this, half shook their heads and said, "It's part of the folklore." The other half said to tell me not to call it a ghost tour, which is just as well because there are very few ghosts in Highland. They say the place is dead. I told you the jokes were bad. Every guy remembers that girl at the dance with the really cold hands, and every girl remembers that guy at the dance who was kind of stiff. Now you know. Highland was dedicated in 1864. It is an example of the rural cemetery movement, which began in Boston at Mount Auburn in the 1830s, a deliberate attempt to make a cemetery beautiful. Highland is probably the best example of it in the state of Michigan. It is the third city cemetery. I will talk more about those later. And behind you is Starkweather Chapel, a gift of Mary Ann Starkweather in the Roman Romanesque style. She inherited a small fortune from an uncle, and she gave 4 major gifts to the city. Starkweather Chapel being one. Her home for use as a public library on North Huron Street. The public drinking fountain that is missing stood 12 feet tall, was made of bronze, topped with a statue of Hebe, cupbearer to the gods and goddess of youth, and had drinking bowls for people, horses, and dogs. Apparently she didn't like cats. So now, I'm afraid there's probably not enough lanterns to go around. I'm sorry. But you spend 3 hours an afternoon cleaning and oiling lanterns and see how you feel. So we're gonna, so couples may have to share and snuggle, I'm sorry. So so let's see how many of you can pick out lanterns if you haven't already. So let's go this way.
Six people just heard you say something strange outside.
Fourth and take the light.
Sorry, what did you say?
Oh my god.
I was like looking for you.
Okay. Now a little bit about Lantern 101. You might be tempted to turn the flame up really high. These are kerosene-based lanterns. But it should not go more than 1/3 the size, the height of the globe for the best light. If you go too high, you get smoke and soot, which means tomorrow I'm going to be spending time cleaning it. Such an ego trip watching all these people try and catch up with me. Act as if I think I know what I'm doing. Clara Doyle, born 1854, died 1915. She graduated from the Michigan State Normal School, now Eastern Michigan University. She was a teacher and did not marry. Sadly, she died of cancer and died the day she was to have been married. She was in her 60s, dodged the bullet all those years, and when she finally gave in. Now, well, everybody has a story. Now, does anybody here know how many people are interned in Highland Cemetery?
All of them?
That's right, all of them. Now, does anybody know the correct answer to the trick question, who is buried in Grant's tomb?
Grant?
Nobody.
The one who said nobody is right. Grant and his wife are not buried in Grant's tomb, they are entombed. They didn't dig a hole and put them in there, they put them on the shelf. Now, the actual number of people interned in Highland Cemetery is about 16,000. Yeah, they come and they don't leave. They like it here. Now, one time I announced that I had seen a Comcast truck out in the cemetery, and I went, boy, they really spoil them here. And a heckler called out, not if it's Comcast. Okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll be happy to make up an answer. Okay, let's move on. These tours are fun. You get the accordion effect. I should mention that Highland is a non-denominational cemetery. Just about every religious denomination practiced in the United States is here. Hindus, Muslims, Protestants, Catholics, Jews. And one time a little girl asked me, are there any witches in the cemetery? Of various kinds. This is the family plot for the Ferrier family. This is a family marker. Here is the grave of Philo Ferrier, who came to the city in 1857 to finish work on the Presbyterian Church. His brother John had started the work, but had died before it was completed. He stayed in Ypsilanti, opened a machine shop on River Street. The business was successful. His son took it over. After the family gave up the business, it continued as a machine shop at least into the 1930s. And today it is the home of the Ypsilanti Co-op. The co-op's been nice to me, so I say nice things about them. He's here. His wife is buried here. I don't know where his brother John is. So now we'll move this way. Some people get nervous about stepping on graves, but in all the years I've been giving these tours, not once has a permanent resident complained to me. Now, I mentioned Highland is the third city cemetery. The first was at Summit and Michigan Avenue, now the site of a liquor store. Bad jokes of spirits abound. The good news is I don't know any. As far as I know, the graves there were never moved. I do know that into the 1920s, children were picking up bones from there and carrying them home, and the parents would tell them to take them back. The second city cemetery is now Prospect Park. Highland, as I mentioned, opened in 1864. The old city cemetery fell into disuse and by the 1890s was overgrown. A group of women decided to turn the old cemetery into a city park. The city park movement came out of the rural cemetery movement. The women began the work, but as one newspaper reported, a mania broke out among the women, and within a year, all but two were married. A new committee was formed, men and women. They completed the work. The city bought 2 lots for the transfer of the graves from the old city cemetery. This is one of them. The other one is over there. And Highland is rich in cemetery iconography symbolism. Here you have the weeping willow, signifying mourning. Over here you have the hand in the book of life, looking you up. Here you have the dove taking the soul to heaven.
So when you walk past the cemetery, you're in it, you see these lights, and these are candles. Actually, probably most of them are solar devices that just light up in remembrance. I know a lot of idiots I've seen on the internet will think this is like spirit activity or whatever. No, it isn't.
I'm talking about this one. That's her husband. Lucy Osbane. Born, what year was it? Oh, she died 1912. She was a professor at the Michigan State Normal School, now Eastern Michigan University. She has the distinction of being the founder of 2 departments: natural science, which is now biology, and physical education. She had been sickly as a child and knew the value of exercise. She and some of the other professors would lead exercise classes on their own in the basement of the original main building, but they needed more. And so one year, a delegation from the State House of Representatives was coming, the Appropriations Committee, and she wanted to put on a presentation to show the need for a gymnasium. The principal, Sill, he turned her down. He said that it would take too long to clear the stage of chairs. Some of the male professors got some boys to practice clearing the stage in a matter of minutes. Still, Sill said no. And for one of the few times in her life, she resorted to a woman's weapon: tears. Sill relented. And when the time came, the young ladies that she had drilled in Indian club use put on their presentation. At first, the men made jokes about how they would Well, they reminisced about how they used to exercise by cutting firewood. Coal had replaced firewood as a source of heat, but that's what that's what they told. And then one made a comment that he'd be damned if he'd marry a woman like that, as if anybody cared. But as the young ladies proceeded, the representatives became quiet. The money was appropriated, and the normal school was one of the first major institutes of higher education to have a gymnasium. It stood in what is now the parking lot in front of the water tower. And in accordance with the practice of the time, it was divided in two. One side for men, one side for women. And there was a wall that went from the foundation right up to the ceiling to divide the two sections. At near the end of one tour, the parents of a little girl pushed her forward to ask a question. Has anyone ever gotten lost in the cemetery? And I gave her a long story about a man whose dog went into the woods, and he went after the dog, and the dog found his way out, but he didn't until the next morning. Later I realized all I had to do was say, I was lost the whole time I gave the tour. That's closer to the truth than I want to admit.
So I like this, kind of just looks like floating orbs at this space. Pretty neat effect. I know about this.
March 1935, 7-year-old Richard Stryker was last seen on his sled in Riverside Park. His parents noticed that he was missing and began searching for him. The next morning, his body was found under the pedestrian bridge that connects Frog Island to Cross Street. Death was caused by multiple stab wounds. Murder. There was a massive police investigation. To simplify, if you were a man in Ypsilanti at that time, you were a suspect. The case has never been solved. One of my colleagues in the archives in the Historical Museum took an interest in the case and interviewed everybody who was still alive that was connected with it, obtained a copy of the state police investigation. His intention was to write a book about it, but he felt his health failed him. And about this time, a reporter for the Ann Arbor News contacted the archives and said that he was going to write a series on cold cases and wanted to start with the Stryker murder. Was there anybody there who could talk to him about it? George was the person he should talk to, but George was in no condition to meet with him. I agreed to meet with him and did as well as I could. He followed up with questions by email, and I mentioned in passing that Richard was buried here in an unmarked grave. He mentioned that fact in his story, which resulted in a GoFundMe campaign, which resulted in another story, and an undertaker in Saline went to breakfast and asked his wife why she looked so sad. She had just read the story, which was illustrated with a picture of Richard in his baseball uniform, and he looked just like their son. And as he later said, I knew at that moment I was going to be buying a headstone. We do not know why there was no headstone on the site for 80 years. It may be because there was suspicion in the family. The mother was a prime suspect, as were others. The authorities may have opposed having a headstone placed on the grave because they were concerned of it becoming some kind of morbid shrine. But as you see, there is now a headstone. It's marked with a sled. because Richard was last seen alive in Riverside Park sledding. His sled was found where he always put it, but not the way he would put it. Was it put there by somebody who found it? Or was it put there by the killer? We don't know. George died before the headstone was dedicated, and his research was turned over to Greg Fortier, the author of Terra in Ypsilanti and the John Norman Collins case. And Fournier published a book based on George's research, A Depot Town Mystery, which is available online. At the dedication ceremony, the minister spoke of the value of every human life. Rule of thumb, when you get to the top of the hill, stop. Behind me is a nature preserve that goes down to the river. It includes rare species of plants and animals. There's sometimes a homeless community out in there. Leave them alone, they leave you alone. And there used to be a pathway marked by 2 stone lions around here. The pathway is still there. It takes about 90 minutes to get to the river and then 90 minutes to get back. We're not doing that path tonight.
I'm definitely up for trying it, just not tonight. Yeah, this is definitely what he's talking about, though.
Charles Kettles was a helicopter pilot in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War, the 1960s. One day he was sent to recover a patrol that had been caught in an ambush. Because of the terrain, they couldn't land to pick the men up. They had to lower a line down to the men, but they couldn't climb up, and they had to attach themselves somehow to it, but they didn't know how. And Charles had to stand in the doorway of the helicopter in full view of the enemy and show them how to do it. And then one by one they were pulled up to the helicopter. The next day, he was sent in command of a mission to pick up a company that had been in a battle all day. Because of the terrain, the helicopters landed in a line. Charles was informed that all the men had been recovered. They started off, and then Charles was told that 4 men had been left behind. Charles gave command of the mission to another officer, went back, picked up the 4 men. Now the helicopter was past its maximum capacity load. And in order to take off, he had to adjust the rotary blades of the helicopter to get enough lift, but he couldn't maintain altitude, so he had to leapfrog for a time. And every time he took off, an enemy shell landed and exploded where they had been. Finally, he was able to get enough stability to return to base. Years later, he was being interviewed for the Veterans Project, and as it was wrapping up, his wife, Ann Cleary Kettles, told him to talk about that incident. He did, and this led to a movement to have his decorations from these 2 missions upgraded to the Medal of Honor. There's a time limit for which applications for the Medal of Honor can be made, and this, of course, had long passed. It took a special act of Congress and a bill signed by President Obama for the Medal of Honor to be awarded to him. And it was at a White House ceremony, and during the ceremony, President Obama said, "Here's another thing we have in common. We do as our wives tell us." Charles' son-in-law told the story about how one time Charles was recounting the mission to his family after dinner, and somebody asked, "Were you frightened when the windscreen of the helicopter was shot away?" He answered, "I was concerned." Charles was a true gentleman.